If you ever find yourself in England's Dorset County, take a trip to the village of Tolpuddle. About 400 people live here, mostly in long, low houses on a quiet thoroughfare without a single traffic light or stop sign. Just off that thoroughfare still stands the mossy medieval parish church of St. John the Evangelist. Long centuries have slowly worn away the writing on its oldest gravestones, but the rest of them are clean and well-maintained despite their age. They're relics, lovingly preserved, like the old chapel trust or the village hall just down the road. Today, Tolpuddle is a cozy, sleepy village. Nothing about it seems remarkable but for the fact that it still exists in the era of high-speed internet. And yet, in the 2 minutes that it takes to drive through Tolpuddle, you'll see the same disturbing word over and over again. The Martyr's Cottage, the Martyr's Inn, the Martyr's Tree, the Martyr's Museum. Outside that museum, you'll find 6 monoliths of dull gray stone that look like dead men's teeth gnawing the earth. Something shocking happened here in 1834, 3 years before Victoria assumed the British throne. Today's episode begins with the story of the Tolpuddle martyrs. The early 1830s were a hard time in the English countryside. An agricultural depression and the slow encroach of machinery were choking the rural poor, few of whom owned land, and most of whom barely eked out a living by working precarious seasonal jobs as hired hands on wealthier people's farms. George Lovelace, a plowman and Methodist preacher from Tolpuddle, had watched his wages and those of his friends decrease from month to month. At first, they received 9 shillings every week. Then their employers cut their pay. Despite doing the same amount of work, they'd only get 8 shillings from now on. Unfortunately, from now on lasted for only a few months. Then, after another pay cut, Tolpuddle's laborers earned 7 shillings every week. Soon afterward, they earned just 6. Lovelace knew that it was impossible to live honestly on such scanty means. Even as his wages shrank, food prices climbed. What was he supposed to do? 1 year before, the Whigs in Parliament, who liked to frame themselves as a progressive party, had passed the so-called Great Reform Act. Thanks to their efforts, about 5% of England's residents enjoyed the right to vote. But Lovelace wasn't one of them. He was too poor to qualify, and so were all his friends. Without representatives in government, Tolpuddle's rural laborers had to take care of themselves. Trade unions had been legal for the past 9 years, but they didn't have the right to go on strike or use collective bargaining for better contracts. Instead, they served as mutual aid societies. Because national health insurance and unemployment benefits didn't exist in the Victorian era, unions collected dues that they used as financial safety nets for members who had lost their jobs. This kind of service is what Lovelace had in mind in 1833, when he and a few of his friends in Tolpuddle formed the Friendly Society of Agricultural Laborers. Rule 21 of the group's founding charter stated that if any master attempts to reduce the wages of his workmen, if they are members of this order, then they shall instantly communicate the same to the corresponding secretary, in order that they may receive the support of the Grand Lodge. Lovelace's Friendly Society helped its members sleep at night by guaranteeing that their families wouldn't starve to death if they were fired. Despite this modest goal, collective action was still very controversial. In villages where everybody knows each other, joining a union often led your friends and neighbors to perceive you as a troublemaker. Moreover, Britain's wars with revolutionary France remained a fairly recent memory in 1833. Parliament had spent 2 decades vilifying labor movements by identifying them with foreign spies. As a result, many British citizens believed that union activism looked a lot like treason. Did our fathers, sons, and husbands fight and die in France for you to turn their native village into revolutionary Paris? Our nation's heroes sacrificed their lives for liberty, not liberté. Lovelace knew that everyone who joined his union would be putting their good reputation on the line. Seeking to protect himself and those around him, he devised an elaborate induction ritual that required prospective members to swear formal oaths of secrecy. One such member, Edward Legge, was ushered to a union leader's house in Tolpuddle, where he was blindfolded and asked to kneel while people recited the rules of the Friendly Society. When Legge's blindfold was removed, he saw George Lovelace towering before him in the white robes of a churchman. Above his head, someone had hanged the image of a human skeleton, with the words, "Remember your end," scrawled across it. Lovelace made the frightened Edward Legge swear not to tell a soul about the group that he had joined. Today, this kind of induction ceremony might attract attention. During the 19th century, it was a fairly common element of English culture. Trade unions, guilds, and the Masonic order all practiced peculiar rites and rituals. College fraternities in the United States still practice them. However strange or silly these rites look to outsiders, they serve a crucial social function by binding men to people who aren't their blood relatives. In this context, the skeleton that Legge saw hanging from the ceiling wasn't a death threat. It was a memento mori carefully designed to make him contemplate the solemn duty that he owed to humankind at large. Some historians have compared Victorian Union oaths to marriage ceremonies. You made a solemn vow to God that you would keep your promise to your comrades, whom you'd cherish and protect as though they were your flesh. In an age before mass literacy, oaths fulfilled the role of legal contracts. What you swore to do, you did. There was just one problem. Edward Legge didn't do what he swore. Rather than keeping the Tolpuddle Union a secret, he ratted to a local magistrate about it. That magistrate informed the squire, who informed Lord Melbourne, the Home Secretary in Parliament. Melbourne was a typical British aristocrat. Unions of all kinds disgusted and alarmed him. Therefore, he advised the magistrates of Tolpuddle to crack down on Lovelace's Friendly Society by invoking an obscure old law that forbade soldiers and sailors from swearing oaths to each other. This law had originally been designed to prevent mutinies among the Royal Navy's lower-class conscripts, many of whom realized that the revolutionary French Republic served their interests better than the British monarchy. Melbourne, however, was confident that a loose interpretation of the law would allow judges to apply it to men in general, not merely soldiers or sailors. According to this loose interpretation, anyone who swore an oath to obey the secret commands of a group that didn't have official legal backing was automatically committing a crime, regardless of what the oath entailed or what the group represented. A wartime law against mutiny thus became a peacetime law against unions. In both cases, the poor were its natural targets. The members of Tolpuddle's Friendly Society didn't learn about Legge's betrayal until it was too late. In early 1834, Lovelace and 5 other Union leaders were arrested and brought to trial for administering what the judge described as an unlawful oath. The prosecutor, who had family ties to wealthy nobles, based his argument upon Lord Melbourne's instructions. For good measure, he also called attention to the image of the skeleton that Edward Legge had seen at his induction ceremony. Surely, the prosecutor claimed, this image threatened death against the Union members, their employers, or even the entire British government. Alongside the prosecution's colorful appeal to fear, the defense's case looked pale and unconvincing. They argued, correctly but pedantically, that the Union leaders' actions were not crimes under the traditional interpretation of the law in question. They quoted statutes. They made careful legal claims. In all likelihood, they bored the jury. After approximately 5 minutes of deliberation, it found all 6 defendants guilty. They were sentenced to 7 years' exile in Australia, where they would undergo hard labor in a penal colony. This was an astonishingly severe sentence. On paper, 7 years in exile was only 7 years in exile. In practice, it probably meant a death sentence or a life spent apart from your family. Many British convicts in Australia lost their lives to illness or malnourishment, and few of those who survived their term in prison had the money to afford a boat ride back home to the other side of the planet. The judge in the Tolpuddle case was forthright about his intention to discourage future labor activists by making an example out of the 6 union leaders. 5 of them were shipped to Botany Bay, near Sydney, where they were forced to work as convict slaves to wealthy landowners. A worse fate awaited Lovelace, the union's original founder. He was sent to Tasmania, where he was bound to the farm of the tyrannical, genocidal Lieutenant Governor Sir George Arthur. News of the Tolpuddle verdict spread quickly throughout England. It outraged the working poor, who rallied under the cry that Britons never will be slaves. In April 1834, up to 100,000 London workers demonstrated near King's Cross. Soon, they'd gathered more than twice that many signatures for a petition to pardon the convicted union leaders, who were now called the Tolpuddle Martyrs. After Lord Melbourne refused the petition, the protests steadily intensified. Workers illegally went on strike. They nursed each other back to health after traumatic clashes with the police. In the process, they swapped stories and political ideas. Before long, they realized how dissatisfied they felt with the Whig Party's so-called Great Reform Act, which hadn't given any poor people the right to vote. The Tolpuddle Martyrs, who had been a rallying cry for economic justice and the right to join a union, now also became a rallying cry for political justice and a new wave of parliamentary reforms that would grant universal suffrage to the men of the working class. This development alarmed the British government, whose rich and powerful elites had no desire to enact additional reforms. Once it became clear that the political cost of keeping the martyrs in prison outweighed the benefit, a new Home Secretary, Lord John Russell, officially pardoned all 6 men. By now, it was 1836. The Union leaders had been suffering in Australia for 2 long years, and because Parliament didn't dispatch a messenger to tell them they'd been pardoned, they remained there for another year before returning home to England. When they finally stepped off the transport ships, the public greeted them as heroes. The law that had sent them to prison, however, remained in full effect. Lord Russell was a canny politician playing a long game. By granting freedom to 6 wrongfully convicted men, he calmed the working class and thereby kept the country's economic and political system running smoothly. Today, the laborers of England would receive an afternoon of joyous celebration. Tomorrow, bright and early, they'd go back to work. Lovelace enjoyed a fleeting period of fame and recognition. He even published his side of the Tolpuddle story in a pamphlet titled The Victims of Whiggery. Soon, though, all 6 of the Tolpuddle Martyrs once more found themselves sweating in the fields as low-paid seasonal laborers. Actually, their situation was much worse than it had been years earlier. Court hearings, prison labor, and a stressful journey back and forth across the planet had sapped their health and permanently damaged their career prospects. After failing to secure a new foothold in Dorset, 5 of the martyrs, including Lovelace, reluctantly emigrated to Canada in search of better lives. Only one martyr, James Hammett, stayed in Tolpuddle, where he died impoverished in a workhouse in the 1890s. Today, Hammett is buried in the village churchyard. His name hasn't yet worn away from its small gravestone. The story of the Tolpuddle Martyrs illustrates the limits of political and economic reform during the early 1830s. According to the traditional, patriotic narrative of British history, these years were a triumphant period of forward-facing policy that laid the groundwork for a stable Victorian era. Parliament, the story goes, achieved a non-violent social revolution by granting ordinary people rights and privileges at a measured, incremental pace that avoided the outbursts of bloodshed and anarchy that periodically erupted across France. This patriotic narrative of British history casts Parliament as an essentially well-meaning, essentially rational body that not only wanted reform, but also knew how to achieve it. In this episode, I'm going to present a very different interpretation of the early 1830s. I argue that during these years, Victorian Britain's upper and upper middle classes joined forces in a united front against the nation's ordinary citizens. Faced with a rising tide of populist resentment, panicky elites enacted a far-ranging program of social, political, and economic reforms designed not to benefit the masses, but instead to shore up the endangered position of aristocrats, landlords, and merchants. Contrary to the patriotic narrative of British history, the propertied classes in Parliament weren't far-seeing humanitarians or democratic theorists. Rather than declaring war on poverty, they launched a preemptive strike against the nation's poor. My name is Brian Reinken. Welcome to Episode 2 of Melting into Air. Chapter 1. Lord Wellington and Robert Peel. Thomas Carlyle, the cantankerous Victorian social critic we met in the previous episode, famously proclaimed that the history of the world is nothing but the biography of great men. According to this aptly named great man theory, historical change occurs due to the force of strong personalities like Martin Luther's or Oliver Cromwell's. As you'll see throughout this podcast, I don't believe that Carlyle's theory is sufficient to explain what causes history to happen. Nonetheless, I recognize that personalities are part of the explanation, especially when we're interested in the upper echelons of government. During the early 1830s, for example, the prejudices of the Duke of Wellington and Robert Peel, two of Parliament's most powerful Tory leaders, helped to plunge the British state into a crisis of reform. Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, was born in Dublin in 1769. His family belonged to the Protestant ascendancy, the small, privileged group of English Anglicans who'd governed Ireland as settler colonists for several centuries. Wellesley spent his childhood moving between his parents' manor home and their ancestral castle. After attending Eton College, an elite boys-only boarding school, he enlisted in the British Army, where the colonial campaigns he won in India brought him widespread renown. At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, Wellesley received command of British forces in Iberia, and he turned that region into what a furious Napoleon called the Spanish Ulcer. In honor of his military feats, Wellesley was named the Earl, then the Marquess, then finally the Duke of Wellington. His finest hour, of course, came in 1815 during the Battle of Waterloo, where he and his fellow aristocrat, the Prussian Field Marshal von Blücher, defeated Napoleon and crushed the revolutionary dream of liberty, equality, and brotherhood once and for all. After the Napoleonic Wars, Wellington commanded a multinational European army of occupation designed to repress popular opposition to the restored Bourbon monarchy. When he returned to Britain in 1818, his status as a military hero soon propelled him to a leadership position in the conservative Tory party. In January 1828, he became Prime Minister. Despite his impressive military achievements, or more likely because of them, Wellington struggled as a politician. To his credit, he was a tireless worker who rose before dawn and never failed to do his duty as he understood it. To his detriment, he was an aristocrat and career soldier who was used to giving orders, not to making deals. Famously stubborn and infamously proud, he challenged one of his political critics to a pistol duel in 1829. Both men fired shots, neither was killed, but historians disagree about whether Wellington graciously aimed wide of his opponent or whether he just missed his mark due to poor eyesight. Personally, my money is on the latter. Wellington believed himself superior to almost all his fellow countrymen by merit and by birth. In 1813, he denigrated common soldiers as the scum of the earth, and after he became Prime Minister, he initially refused to move into 10 Downing Street because he thought that it was small and ugly in comparison to Apsley House, his vast private mansion, which was just a few minutes' stroll from Buckingham Palace. For as long as Wellington led the Tory party, its rising star was the young, privileged Robert Peel. Born in 1788 to a millionaire father who had made his fortune in the cotton textile industry, Peel was educated in prestigious and expensive schools like Harrow and Oxford. When he was 21 years old, his father and the Duke of Wellington bought him a seat in Parliament by bribing voters in an Irish borough. 3 years later, Peel became Chief Secretary for Ireland, where he wielded his vast power to suppress and prosecute pro-Catholic activists. In 1822, Peel finally found his political calling as Britain's Home Secretary, an office that he held for nearly 8 years straight. After his mentor, Wellington, became Prime Minister in 1828, almost everyone expected that Peel would inherit the Tory party's leadership someday. It was only a matter of time before the Iron Duke retired or passed on. There are 3 important things to remember about Robert Peel. First, he was younger than most of his colleagues. Some people regarded him as a wunderkind who excelled in classics and mathematics. Others regarded him as a spoiled daddy's boy who stank of new money. The second thing to remember is that Peel was smug, cold, and aloof, even by upper-class standards. His insistence that everyone around him behave absolutely rationally at all times made him a hard man to befriend. The last thing to remember is that Peel was a British exceptionalist. He had come of age at a time when Britain was blockading revolutionary Europe. Later in life, he always felt his country had the power and the moral right to chart its own course in the world. Ireland was dragged along that course against its will. In 1800, British lawmakers had passed the Act of Union, which formally absorbed Ireland into Britain and required all Irish representatives to sit in Parliament in London. The architects of this new system hoped that it would snuff out Irish nationalism for all time. Instead, unsurprisingly, it had the opposite effect. By 1828, Prime Minister Wellington, Home Secretary Robert Peel, and the rest of Britain's Tory government faced a well-organized and very passionate campaign for Irish Catholic rights. Their botched attempts to silence that campaign would energize it and inaugurate a years-long crisis of reform. Chapter 2. Reforming Religion. After the 1800 Act of Union, Irish nationalists had irrefutable evidence that Britain was plotting to strip away their freedom and concentrate political power in the hands of legislators sitting on the wrong side of the Irish Sea. In 1803, the Republican activist Robert Emmet tried to stage an anti-colonial uprising in Dublin. He failed, and a British jury sentenced him to death, but not before he used his trial to publicize his arguments against the colonial regime. As courtroom stenographers took careful note, Emmet delivered a defiant speech at the bar. "I wished to procure for my country the guarantee which George Washington procured for America. When Ireland takes her place among the nations of the earth, then, and not till then, let my epitaph be written." In the decade after Emmet's martyrdom, low-level political violence spilled across the Irish countryside. Years of bad harvests motivated desperate groups of Catholic tenant farmers to beat and murder wealthy Protestant landlords before looting and burning their houses. Many of these so-called Rockite rebels believed in the apocalyptic prophecies of Pastorini, a Catholic bishop who predicted that Jesus would return to earth and eradicate Protestantism in 1821. When Jesus failed to appear by that deadline, the disappointed Rockite movement quickly fizzled out. Brief though it was, the Rockites' sectarian violence revealed how closely Irish Catholicism had become entangled with opposition to British imperialism. As I mentioned in episode 1, the Anglican Church was the official religious institution of the British government. Every single candidate on every single ballot on every single national election had to be an Anglican. This requirement meant that the MPs who represented Ireland didn't reflect the makeup of its population. For one thing, the vast majority of Irish citizens were Catholics. For another, even the vast majority of Irish Protestants were Presbyterians or Methodists, not Anglicans. Religious tension across Ireland set the stage for an activist named Daniel O'Connell. Born into a wealthy Irish Catholic family in 1775, he was educated at a Jesuit college in France, where he read breaking news about the storming of the Bastille and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Around the time of King Louis's beheading, O'Connell realized that France was growing dangerous for Jesuits and foreigners, whom it increasingly regarded as internal enemies. Rather than literally risk his neck, he returned home to Ireland in 1793. Much later in life, he claimed that he then joined the United Irishmen, a group that launched an unsuccessful revolution against British rule in 1798. In fact, O'Connell seems to have fought on Britain's side against the anti-colonial rebels. He was never comfortable with extra-legal violence, which he worried would inevitably end with rich men's heads on pikes. By the turn of the 19th century, he ranked among the best-paid lawyers in the country. What did he really stand to gain from open war against the state? Despite his opposition to political violence, O'Connell's fierce commitment to Catholicism guaranteed that he would never be a British stooge. As his income and his public profile rose, he began to chafe at Britain's ban on Catholic office holders. All Protestants, he claimed, were spiritually foreigners to Ireland regardless of their place of birth. Why should they get to hold office when he couldn't? In 1823, he determined to end this injustice by forming the Catholic Association, a political pressure group that lobbied for what he called Catholic emancipation. That is, the right for wealthy Catholics like himself to sit in government. O'Connell's political agenda foreshadows a strain of anti-colonialism that we'll see many times throughout this podcast. The man was rich, well-educated, and perfectly capable of speaking to lawmakers in terms they understood. Only his religion separated him from ordinary British statesmen. In this context, he had no desire whatsoever to destroy the British ruling class. To the contrary, he wanted to join that class as an equal partner capable of dominating Ireland like other wealthy men. Of course, this isn't how British conservatives like Robert Peel perceived his efforts. First as Chief Secretary in Ireland, then as Home Secretary in Britain, Peel sabotaged O'Connell's agenda however he could. He dismantled pro-Catholic bills, he prosecuted pro-Catholic newspapers, he even banned the Catholic Association, after which O'Connell, undeterred, immediately founded an identical group called the New Catholic Association. Catholic nationalism threatened the British establishment because the Irish populace at large supported it. O'Connell's pressure groups collected dues from members, which made them feel as though they had a personal stake in Ireland's future. His stirring oratory even won support from Irish tenant farmers, who, just a few years earlier, had placed their faith in the apocalyptic prophecies of Pastorini. In these farmers' eyes, O'Connell, much like Christ, appeared to be a righteous national deliverer campaigning against foreign exploitation. They hoped he could inaugurate heaven on earth. O'Connell's lobbying campaign finally paid off during the parliamentary elections of 1826, when many victorious Anglican candidates endorsed his program of Catholic emancipation. Once emancipation started to appear achievable, it began to drive a wedge into the Tory party. On one side was a faction called the Ultra-Tories, who utterly refused to cede ground to the Catholics. They argued that making any concessions to O'Connell's movement would destroy the interests of the British state, defile the values of Protestantism, and turn Ireland into a breeding ground for treason. Opposing the Ultras was a faction of so-called liberal Tories, whose ranks included Wellington and, ultimately, Robert Peel. Despite their personal contempt for Catholics, liberal Tories were generally willing to cut their losses, hold their noses, and support emancipation to prevent widespread disorder. Wellington, who'd orchestrated years of guerrilla war in Spain, knew exactly how expensive, deadly, and destabilizing popular unrest could grow. Peel, in contrast, found the nonviolence of Catholic emancipation more terrifying than the prospect of a civil war. O'Connell had rejected mob rule. He was decent and articulate in public. From Peel's perspective, it was better to accept Catholic emancipation, which was relatively harmless, than to persecute its leaders and transform them into martyrs. As everyone in Britain knew, the lions in the Roman amphitheater hadn't been enough to silence Christianity. In May 1828, Wellington's government repealed the Test and Corporation Acts, which had required office holders to accept the Eucharist inside an Anglican church. The Prime Minister believed that this repeal was an effective compromise with the reformist lobby. In fact, it was an ineffective half-measure that aggravated everyone without appeasing anyone. O'Connell's allies pointed out that all national office holders were still required to denounce transubstantiation, the invocation of the Virgin Mary, and other non-negotiable Catholic rites. At the same time, ultra-Tories howled that Wellington had gone too far and that the British Constitution was in ruins. The question of Catholic emancipation clearly wasn't settled. Just as clearly, Wellington was not the kind of politician who could settle it. Except for the ultra-Tories, almost every person in his inner circle was advising him that Catholic emancipation looked inevitable. At this point, they suggested, it was better to enact it quickly and accept the fallout than to drag it out and make things even worse. Wellington agreed with this assessment of the situation. But, as a military general and an aristocrat, he preferred to give orders, not take them. The more his fellow politicians pressured him, the harder he resisted their advice. If he did what they were asking, he complained, then everyone would say that he was acting out of weakness rather than integrity. Yes, he was willing to emancipate the Catholics, but only if the whole world knew that it was his idea. Now, he grumbled, no one would believe that it was his idea. This attitude exasperated many of the liberal Tories in his government, several of whom soon resigned in protest. Then, out of necessity or simply childish pettiness, Wellington replaced the people who'd resigned with ultra-Tories. That is, with the faction of his party that opposed the very policy that he was trying to enact. All of this was bad enough for the Prime Minister. But things grew much worse in July 1828, when O'Connell proclaimed his intention to stand for election in Ireland's County Clare. As a Catholic, he was still legally prohibited from holding office. Nevertheless, his popularity with voters all but guaranteed that he would win his seat. O'Connell was forcing Wellington to make a choice: either arrest and imprison a Catholic candidate who won a free and fair election, or ignore the letter of the law and set a precedent that Catholics could take office, or enact Catholic emancipation right now and avoid the whole ugly controversy. As Wellington and the ultra-Tories in his cabinet shouted contradictory solutions at each other, anti-Catholic paramilitaries known as Brunswick clubs began to arm themselves for civil war. Soon, violence erupted across Ireland as Protestant Brunswickers beat, robbed, and terrorized their Catholic neighbors. This situation might have spelled the end of Wellington's prime ministry. Luckily for him, however, the opponents of Catholic emancipation had finally gone a step too far. Liberal Tories, and even many ultras, recoiled at the spectacle of violence in the streets, and they vowed to stop it by whatever means they could. In February 1829, Wellington seized upon his party's temporary show of unity to publicly announce its full support of Catholic emancipation. 2 months later, Parliament hastily passed the Catholic Relief Act. Civil war had been averted, and a centuries-long ban on Catholic office holders had been overturned. The Catholic Relief Act of 1829 was a political inevitability that Wellington resisted until it was too late for him to earn any goodwill by passing it. Like the previous year's repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, Catholic emancipation incurred criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. As soon as the immediate danger of civil war had abated, ultra-Tories resumed their furious jeremiads about the state of British morals and religion. Meanwhile, O'Connell and his allies seethed when they began to read the Relief Act's fine print. First, it banned the New Catholic Association, O'Connell's political pressure group. Second, it overturned O'Connell's electoral victory in County Clare on the basis that he'd been ineligible to hold office when he won. If he wanted to assume his seat in Parliament, then he would need to win a new election. Finally, the Relief Act made it harder for him to win. By raising the property requirement for suffrage rights, it disenfranchised about 400,000 Irish voters, most of whom were Catholics. These provisions reveal that, ultra-Tory complaints notwithstanding, the Catholic Relief Act never posed an existential threat to the British establishment. Instead, it was deliberately designed to strangle Irish Catholic populism and to reassert the power of the landed gentry. Emancipation benefited very wealthy Catholics. For those who lacked vast wealth, it was a symbolic victory without real material benefits. Many ordinary Catholics lost their right to vote. They would never have the money needed to hold office, and there was absolutely no guarantee that wealthy Catholic politicians would represent their interests any more faithfully than wealthy Anglicans had done. In all likelihood, the rich would look out for the rich regardless of which church they worshipped in. Daniel O'Connell himself was the Catholic Relief Act's foremost beneficiary. Its passage canonized him as the undisputed voice of Catholic Ireland. His supporters nicknamed him the Liberator. Countless ballads lionized him as a saint or a Gaelic hero like the men from ancient tales. Meanwhile, he became the darling of political theorists. In 1835, he inspired the French writer Alexis de Tocqueville to embark upon a tour of Ireland. 10 years later, O'Connell and Frederick Douglass bonded over their shared opposition to American slavery. O'Connell held a parliamentary seat throughout the 1830s. While in office, he molded the small but growing number of Irish Catholic legislators into a powerful voting bloc. Mathematically, there was no hope that they would ever have enough members to form a majority government. There were enough of them, however, to make or break a coalition, which gave them a degree of influence disproportionate to their size. Having won the battle for Catholic emancipation, O'Connell now felt confident and powerful enough to turn his resources upon a new, more radical political cause. He envisioned Home Rule under an independent Irish Parliament. This meant repealing the Act of Union between Britain and Ireland. Repeal, however, proved more difficult to realize than emancipation. Britain's rulers had refused to countenance a civil war over the issue of Catholic office holders. They knew that the campaign to emancipate Catholics symbolized Ireland's eagerness to participate in and cooperate with the actually existing British regime. In contrast, the prospect of Irish withdrawal from the Union meant civil war by default. Protestant lawmakers warned that Home Rule was another way of saying Rome Rule. In other words, Catholics in an independent Ireland would turn the clock back to the papal Middle Ages. Even if that didn't happen, they'd align with France and invade Britain on two fronts. Even if that didn't happen, their departure from the Union would produce a domino effect that would eventually topple Britain's empire. It's noteworthy that all these arguments pivot on anti-Catholic paranoia. Until the 1820s, Irish Protestants like Robert Emmet had led the resistance against British rule. That situation changed dramatically after emancipation, when Irish nationalism became practically synonymous with Catholicism. After 1829, some Protestants still dreamed of independent Ireland. As O'Connell's Catholic nationalists grew stronger, however, many Irish Presbyterians and Methodists began to fear that Protestants would be a vulnerable minority in any independent Irish state. In this context, they began to look more favorably upon the union with Britain. Ireland wasn't independent, and that was unfortunate. But, all things considered, they thought it was better to be ruled by English Protestants than Irish Catholics. No matter how a person felt about Catholic emancipation or home rule, one thing was obvious in the summer of 1829. Political reform was possible, and change was in the air. Faced with the writing on the wall, Home Secretary Peel had cut his losses and embraced the Catholic Relief Act. Although he didn't like this outcome, he was confident that he could find a way to manage it. After all, he knew from long experience how best to deal with Irish troublemakers. You just needed a police force and an iron fist. Chapter 3. Reforming Criminal Justice. Empires don't like to acknowledge that anyone within their borders might oppose them for legitimate reasons. Ancient Roman governors dismissed rebellious armies of impoverished peasants as rabble or brigands. Benito Mussolini slandered anti-fascist partisans as bandits. In the 21st century, terrorist has become the preferred term to tar and feather empire's enemies. All of these words imply that anti-colonial resistance is inherently malicious, politically criminal, and intellectually opposed to reason. Consequently, they suggest that the only appropriate way to handle this resistance is to crush it with the state's security apparatus. After the 1800 Act of Union, British legislators grew obsessed with the problem of Irish crime. This was the umbrella term that they invoked to characterize the popular uprisings and low-level guerrilla conflicts that racked the Irish countryside throughout the early 19th century. During this period, Ireland had more mouths to feed than ever before in its history, but the average Irish person owned an ever smaller plot of farmland, or, increasingly, no land at all. Impoverished peasants wandered desperately throughout the countryside in search of food and work. Oftentimes, they banded into groups for safety or for mutual aid. These groups sometimes turned violent, in which case they usually attacked well-to-do merchants and landlords. Today's historians typically interpret 19th century Ireland's civic unrest in socioeconomic terms. It was the product of rapid population growth, poor harvests, and anti-colonial anger. In the eyes of the British establishment, however, Ireland's roving bands of peasants proved that something in the Irish character was rotten. Few men in Parliament dared to imply that popular resentment of Ireland's parasitic governing elite might have been justified. It was much easier for them to make political careers by arguing that Irish people were, by nature, rebellious or work-shy or contemptuous of the law. Ideologies of race and racism as we know them today were still taking shape during the 19th century. But by as early as the 1500s, writers such as Edmund Spenser had begun to formulate a set of theories that purported to explain the difference between the English and the Irish mind. These theories weren't yet racial or biological per se. Instead, they emphasized geography and culture to explain why certain groups of people were allegedly superior to others. In fact, it was because these proto-racist theories emphasized geography and culture, not biology, that Victorian thinkers could deploy them to advocate the humanistic benefits of British colonialism. According to the standard line of argument, the flaws in the Irish character were not inherent. Much like a child's temper tantrums, they could be corrected and stamped out by means of discipline. But how exactly could you discipline a nation? That was easy. You just had to discipline its people at systemic levels. Robert Peel, who served as Chief Secretary for Ireland from 1812 to 1818, made the eradication of Irish crime one of his top priorities. In 1814, he passed the Peace Preservation Act, which laid the groundwork for a colonial police force capable of maintaining order and defending private property. This act replaced Ireland's local, part-time, or volunteer constables with professional, full-time police officers under the command of a single centralized office based in Dublin Castle. local control over matters of law and order came to an end. Now, county magistrates whose jurisdictions experienced civic unrest were empowered to summon a force of up to 50 officers recruited from outside their districts. Peel believed that these officers, who lacked any personal ties to the areas they policed, would be willing to enforce the law much more coldly and rigorously than they would have done if they had been patrolling towns inhabited by their close friends and family members. The Peace Preservation Act almost immediately turned Dublin into the most heavily policed city in the British Empire. It took several years before Peel's system spread throughout the Irish countryside, but by 1825, the new police force had quashed almost all rural unrest. The rural poor were not the only targets of the new police force. Its wanted list also included politicians. In 1831, the Royal Irish Constabulary arrested Daniel O'Connell on dubious charges of conspiracy against the British state. These charges came in response to his steadfast demands for Parliament to repeal the Act of Union. For what it's worth, O'Connell and his enemies both knew that these demands would never come to pass. Official votes rejected every single one of them, and they often did so with staggering majorities, like 38 in favor and 523 against. Even so, O'Connell's activism embarrassed the British establishment. His arrest was a barely veiled threat to shut up, toe the line, and keep his head down in the future. He understood the message loud and clear. Although he never dropped the issue of repeal entirely, he did start to conform more closely to the norms of English parliamentary debate. In 1828, Robert Peel became Home Secretary in Lord Wellington's government. As the Prime Minister's right-hand man, he cited his experience suppressing Irish crime to justify developing a new police force for London and its suburbs. There was just one problem. Whereas Ireland's unrest was mostly rural, Britain's was becoming steadily more urban. As I discussed in Episode 1, socioeconomic changes in the English countryside were displacing huge numbers of people, many of whom migrated to cities to seek work or shelter. Between 1750 and 1851, London's population increased from about 700,000 to about 2.4 million people. Naturally, many of the newcomers found work and prospered. But, just as naturally, many of them didn't. Rootless and desperate, they often turned to petty crime in order to survive. Criminals called drag sneaks snatched goods from carts. Star glazers cut the panes out of shop windows. Snoozers slept at railway stations and swiped inattentive passengers' belongings. Skinners enticed sailors to sleep with them, then stole their clothes in the night. Karl Marx, who spent the last 3 decades of his life in London, categorized all of these people as the lumpen proletariat, a tumultuous underclass whose members had been economically displaced by capitalist development. In his words, the lumpen proletariat's ranks included vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, pimps, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, the whole indefinite, disintegrated mass, thrown hither and thither by the upheavals of a capitalist economy. Victorian lawmakers, who of course didn't read Karl Marx, typically referred to the lumpen proletariat as the dangerous classes. Some of these lawmakers believed that poverty was a divinely ordained punishment for sin. Others nursed post-revolutionary paranoia of the urban masses. In any case, most Britons feared that crime was socially contagious. Accordingly, English judicial theory held that it was best to separate the morally diseased from healthy, law-abiding strata of the population. Prison, including the regime of penal colonies abroad, was understood to be a form of social quarantine. As Home Secretary under Wellington, Peel insisted that he could cure London of its criminal habits just like he'd cured Ireland years earlier. To that end, his Metropolitan Police Act came into effect in 1829. Like its Irish predecessor, this act subsumed local, part-time, or volunteer constables under the authority of a single centralized office, Scotland Yard, which reported to the Home Secretary himself. Part-time law enforcement agents were either converted into or replaced with full-time professionals, who were nicknamed Bobbies in honor of their boss, Robert Bob Peel. Additionally, 1,000 fresh recruits were hired to triple the new police force's existing ranks. All recruits received official uniforms and training. Their duties included patrolling the streets and making arrests, but also lighting lamps, calling out the time, and watching for fires. Several subsequent police acts disseminated London's new model of law enforcement across Britain. Today, the so-called Peelian principles remain the basis for policing in the United Kingdom and its former settler colonies. Foremost among these principles is the idea that the police are supposed to be the friends and allies of the country's law-abiding citizens. In Peel's words, the police are the public, and the public are the police. Whether the Metropolitan Police Act lived up to its lofty ideals, and even whether those ideals were lofty in the first place, depends upon your point of view. Seeing London's crime rate rapidly decrease, many British legislators hailed the new policing system as a triumph. Ordinary citizens were far more skeptical. They observed, for instance, that although the crime rate fell in London, it rose by the same degree in nearby towns and villages. Peel's police weren't deterring crime, they were merely moving it to areas where wealthy people didn't live. Some citizens also resented the very existence of a professional, government-funded police force. Such a thing, they thought, was appropriate to a czarist dystopia like Russia or a backwater wasteland like Ireland, but it was offensive and authoritarian in liberty-loving England, which had always been a green and pleasant country. Peel tried to combat negative public perceptions by dressing his police officers in uniforms that looked quite different from the red coats worn by British soldiers. His fixation on superficial aesthetic details changed few people's minds, however. Most citizens paid far more attention to Lord Wellington's habit of appointing his old army buddies to high-ranking police jobs. This habit seemed to confirm the public's perception that London was becoming an armed camp under the sway of a military strongman. Given the new police system's unpopularity, officers who interacted with civilians often faced sullen noncompliance or even outright hostility. The officers grew frustrated, occasionally they lashed out with violence, and the gap between the police and the public grew and grew. In hindsight, it's hard not to suspect that this was part of the plan all along. Peel had said that the police should serve the public, but his definition of that word, public, reflected his status as a millionaire politician with an Oxford education and an infamous superiority complex. Throughout the 1830s, he and his successors in the office of the Home Secretary repeatedly unleashed the bobbies to corral, assault, and arrest striking workers across London. Lopsided clashes like these prompted the historian E.P. Thompson to reflect that, in the eyes of the law, the worst offense against property was to have none. As Peel's police force systematically detained the nation's common criminals alongside law-abiding advocates of social, economic, or political reform, the number of people sentenced to serve time in Australian penal colonies reached unprecedented levels. In 1833, approximately 7,000 British citizens were shipped overseas against their will. Transportation rates remained exceptionally high until the decade's end, at which point they finally declined. Part of this decline was caused by free Australian settlers' resentment that the British government kept sending criminals to live with them. Part of it was caused by a humanitarian outcry against the conditions inside penal colonies. But, ultimately, the decline in transportation rates mostly reflected the increased availability of prisons within Britain. By 1839, British lawmakers had passed several acts that authorized the renovation of old prisons, as well as the construction of new ones. The most notorious of the new was Pentonville, which opened on the northeast side of London in 1842. Its inmates were confined in isolation from each other. Even when they assembled for daily exercise routines or chapel services, they were forbidden from speaking, and they were forced to wear cloth masks that hid their faces. Pentonville was the ideological heir to Millbank, a prison that had opened on the left bank of the Thames near today's Tate Britain Museum. Originally designed by the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who wanted to use it as a test site for his new panopticon surveillance model, Millbank never actually included a panopticon. Nonetheless, its design was innovative and intimidating. The prison had 6 pentagonal wards, each of which radiated from one side of a 3-story hexagonal fortress. From above, the complex looked like a dark flower in bloom. 2 of Millbank's wards were reserved for female prisoners. The other 4 held male ones. All the wards were poorly ventilated, and their sewage systems were inadequate. Because Millbank sat atop mosquito-infested marshland, malaria claimed many inmates' lives. Clinical depression was another common killer. Certain inmates could see Westminster Palace from the window of their cells. The contrast between the imperial opulence of central London and the miserable squalor of life behind bars must have been impossible to bear. It's no surprise that many Victorian novelists regarded Millbank as a place of unique horrors. In Charles Dickens' masterpiece, Bleak House, Esther Summerson visits the prison, whose slabs of lifeless concrete cause her to long for the sight of a weed or a blade of stray grass. The most chilling account of Millbank comes from Henry James's 1886 novel The Princess Casamassima, which describes it, lifting its dusky mass from the bank of the Thames, lying there and sprawling over the whole neighborhood, with brown, bare, windowless walls, ugly, truncated pinnacles, and a character unspeakably sad and stern. It looked very sinister and wicked to Miss Pinsent's eyes, and she wondered why a prison should have such an evil face if it was erected in the interest of justice and order. This particular penitentiary struck her as about as bad and wrong as those who were inside it. It threw a blight over the whole place, and made the river look foul and poisonous. This was the world that Robert Peel had made, a world hemmed in by concrete and harassed by men with badges on their chests. In 1830, a year of revolution on the European continent, political unrest would reach the shores of Britain. And, as angry protesters gathered in London, the same phrase would be heard on everybody's lips. No police, no police, no police. Chapter 4. The Revolutions of 1830. After defeating revolutionary France at the Battle of Waterloo, Britain and its allies tried to stamp out the last vestiges of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. From 1815 to 1830, Europe was subjected to reactionary monarchs who used censorship, spy networks, and coercive violence to detect and destroy progressive movements. In the Austrian Empire, Prince Clemens von Metternich banned student groups and dismissed teachers who promoted harmful doctrines. In the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, King Victor Emmanuel I stripped Jews and Protestants of legal rights. In the Papal States, Pope Pius VII banned vaccination programs and dismantled modern streetlights, which he regarded as abominations. Thanks to his efforts, parts of Europe literally grew darker in this period. Oppression's weight was heaviest in France. After the Napoleonic Wars, the victorious counter-revolutionary coalition had restored the ousted Bourbon monarchy. Initially, France's new king, Louis XVIII, embraced some of the revolution's most significant achievements, including the freedom of religion and the appointment of officials based on merit rather than birth. When the king died childless in 1824, however, he was succeeded by his younger brother, Charles X. Louis had always taken care not to provoke excess resentment of the restored Bourbon regime. Charles, an unpleasant and embittered man whose views on politics were centuries out of date, took no such precautions. When he assumed the throne, he gave the Catholic Church control of France's primary schools, tightened press censorship, and offered lavish monetary compensation to all of his aristocratic friends and family members who had lost property during the Revolution. By 1830, Charles and his favorite minister, the Prince of Polignac, were almost universally despised. Hoping to distract his subjects from domestic politics, the king launched an invasion of Algeria. Then, with the public's eyes on Africa, he issued 4 ordinances for the rule of France. The first ordinance imposed additional censorship laws. The second dissolved France's legislature. The third reduced the French electorate to the richest 25% of existing voters, a tiny minority within a tiny minority. The final ordinance called for new elections under this minuscule franchise. What happened next shocked no one except Charles. The Parisians took up arms. They erected barricades. They unfurled the old tricolor flag of the French Revolution. Because the king had shipped the nation's armies to Algeria, there was no one left in France to keep him safe. The July Revolution started on a Monday. By Thursday, it had triumphed. On August 2nd, 1830, Charles abdicated the French throne and exiled himself to London. Charles's distant cousin, Louis Philippe, became the new king of the French. After his coronation, he took measures to ingratiate himself with ordinary people by personally greeting the Parisian crowds and by joining them while they sang La Marseillaise. Louis Philippe adopted the revolutionary tricolor as the country's official flag. He abolished censorship, downgraded the official status of Catholicism, and extended the franchise to approximately 5% of the adult male population. He even called for new elections in the legislature, which led to a liberal majority. In short, the new king conceded that the French Revolution's more moderate achievements could not and should never be undone. He still ruled as a powerful monarch, and he didn't hesitate to repress uprisings against his authority. Unlike his predecessor, however, he was always careful to respect the civil rights and liberties of France's non-aristocratic upper classes. The nation's bankers, financiers, and businessmen knew they could work with him. They felt comfortable with him. Under his auspices, the so-called July monarchy would always be ruled by elites, but they would be elites who looked ahead toward the 19th century, not back at the 18th. Revolutionaries across Europe followed the example of their counterparts in France. In August 1830, Belgian nationalists rebelled against the Netherlands, provoking a year-long conflict that culminated in their winning independence under the newly crowned King Leopold I. Popular insurrections also broke out across Italy and Poland, but Austrian and Russian armies swiftly quelled them. To the relief of reactionaries like Prince Metternich, the map of Europe remained more or less unchanged after an unexpected year of revolutions. Monarchy survived, the upper classes thrived, and although a few new governments had taken power, they were moderates who'd hold the line against more radical uprisings in the future. Everybody knew that there would be more such uprisings sooner or later. In revolutionary Paris, for example, working-class craftsmen and laborers had died on the barricades alongside bourgeois lawyers, bankers, and journalists. They'd expected to win price controls on bread, protections for the rights of guilds, and lower taxes. Instead, the July monarchy offered them nothing. What good was freedom of the press when ordinary workers couldn't read or write? What good were new elections when the vast majority of people couldn't vote? Official narratives about the July Revolution portrayed it as a necessary measure to correct some minor problems with the status quo. Those narratives appealed to France's bourgeoisie. In contrast, France's lower classes hadn't wanted to correct a minor problem with the status quo. For them, the status quo itself had always been a major problem. After 1830, the mood among French workers was resentful. The bourgeoisie had sided with them in pursuit of noble-sounding ends, but when it had no further use for them, it stabbed them in the back and told them to be thankful for the injury. You can literally see the tensions between France's workers and its bourgeoisie in Eugène Delacroix's great painting, Liberty Leading the People, which I've posted on the podcast website at meltingintoair.net. In the center of Delacroix's canvas, a bare-breasted woman carrying a rifle, wearing a revolutionary Phrygian cap, and waving a tricolor flag urges a crowd of rebellious Parisians to follow her across the barricade. In theory, the painting honors the official narrative of 1830. During the Revolution, workers and bourgeoisie fought side by side for the same political goals. Viewers who examine the image more closely, however, will find that it critiques this narrative in subtle ways. For example, it depicts the bourgeoisie as allies of the workers, but it also illustrates that workers outnumber the bourgeoisie by a ratio of 4-1. Delacroix implies two things. First, that working people were responsible for victory in 1830. Second, that the bourgeoisie have wrongly made themselves the masters and oppressors of those people. The next time that Liberty bestrides the barricade, she'll be leading a charge against the July monarchy and its elite bourgeois backers. Delacroix's original audience understood exactly what he was implying. Although his painting was supposed to be displayed in the throne room of Louis Philippe, its inflammatory message irritated so many government ministers that they sent it back to the artist, in whose custody it gathered dust for many years. Unlike much of Europe, Britain didn't face a full-scale revolution in 1830. Nonetheless, what happened on the continent produced spillover effects that led to the downfall of Lord Wellington's Tory government. In early August, Londoners received word almost simultaneously that a revolution had begun in France, and that it had overthrown King Charles X. Lord Wellington and his fellow Tory moderates feared that news. The Prime Minister had been the guard dog of reactionary Europe after Waterloo. Now, he grumbled, the people of England suddenly fancied that they only had to follow the examples of Paris and Brussels in order to acquire all that their imaginations had suggested as the summit of public happiness. Unlike the Tory moderates, the Whigs proved sympathetic to events in France, which they interpreted as the defeat of royal absolutism. More surprisingly, the far-right ultra-Tories sympathized with France's revolution too. Their rabid hatred of Catholicism actually outweighed their fear of change, and they believed that Louis Philippe's July monarchy would be a weaker Catholic power than its predecessor. As Wellington bemoaned the revolutions on the continent, he and his fellow Tory moderates found themselves outflanked on either side by an unlikely coalition of Whigs and ultra-Tories, who seized upon the moment of political uncertainty to put their differences on hold, reach across the aisle, and issue a joint demand for electoral reform. This rare bipartisan alliance illustrates how badly Wellington had mismanaged the debate over Catholic emancipation. By vacillating on the issue until he had no choice except to pass it into law, he'd alienated ultra-Tories without making allies among Whigs. As a result, the far right and the moderate left were both equally unhappy with the center-right establishment. In this context, electoral reform offered Whigs a chance to redraw Britain's parliamentary districts in their favor. Meanwhile, it offered ultra-Tories a tool to dismantle religious equality. They believed that Catholic emancipation would never have passed into law if the demographics in Parliament had better reflected those in Britain as a whole. At a grassroots level, the common people of London had their own reasons to call for reform. To this huge, disenfranchised population, the leaders of the Whig and Tory parties were all indistinguishable landowners with too much wealth and privilege. They'd invited a deposed French monarch to reside in England. The Prime Minister was naming military men to government positions. Home Secretary Robert Peel's police force was arresting anybody who stepped out of line. In August 1830, London workers took to the streets to oppose authoritarian rule. They dressed themselves in revolutionary tricolor cockades and gathered in mass meetings. When law enforcement agents ordered their dispersal, they fought back and cried in unison, "No police, no police, no police." crackdowns by officers prolonged dissent instead of stifling it. In October, 6,000 working Londoners threatened to storm the Bank of England and the Tower of London. At the same time, protesters in Ireland began to mobilize against the Act of Union. Everywhere Prime Minister Wellington looked, there was another demonstration against everything that he held dear. In the autumn, fires broke out across the countryside of southern England, where capitalist development had gradually concentrated land ownership into fewer and fewer hands. By 1830, most rural Britons barely managed to survive by working low-wage, short-term seasonal contracts on richer people's farms. These landless laborers knew perfectly well that their standards of living were lower than those of their parents and grandparents. During the Year of Revolutions, therefore, they gathered into riotous mobs that terrorized merchants and landlords. Across the English countryside, most riots shared one thing in common. The victims whom they were about to target would receive a written warning in the form of a letter signed with the pseudonym Captain Swing. Swing was never a real person. Instead, many different authors wrote the letters in his name. Some of them were semi-literate. Others appear to have been educated. Some even seem to have been educated people trying to disguise their learning underneath a cloak of bogus grammatical errors. Because so many different authors wrote the Swing letters, their content varied wildly from place to place. For example, one presents an ultimatum.
Sir, this is to acquaint you that if your threshing machines are not destroyed by you directly, we shall commence our labor of arson. Signed on behalf of the whole, Swing.
Another letter contains a straightforward threat in the form of a rhyming couplet.
Revenge for thee is on the wing, from thy determined Captain Swing.
One more letter, which is totally devoid of punctuation, says simply, J. Deary, mind your yards, be not of a fire, damn you, D. Nearly all the letters threaten arson. Most are little more than blackmail. All things considered, they're a lot like the anonymous threats that people sometimes send online today. Recipients who ignored the letter's ultimatum to raise wages, hire workers, or smash machines could expect a nighttime visit from a mob of rioters. Some eyewitnesses reported well-dressed protesters whose clothing looked appropriate for a Sunday stroll. Others reported angry gangs of paupers clad in dirty rags. A few even described a topsy-turvy carnival in which drunk crowds wearing white hats rode white horses and played trumpets. In general, the rioters burned barns and smashed machines. Although they often chanted slogans such as "blood for breakfast," the 19th century equivalent of "eat the rich," they almost never actually caused any physical harm. In more than 1,000 separate incidents across England, only one person died, and that person was one of the rioters. By the end of 1830, the Swing riots were beginning to wind down. After more than 3 months of activity, anyone who wanted to participate had already vented their anger. It was also growing too cold to spend time outdoors. Today, it's hard to calculate the value of the property the rioters destroyed. Insurance claims filed by victims across England record about 400 fires, plus about 25 cases of machine breaking. Unfortunately, these claims offer an extremely distorted picture of the damage. Almost everybody had insured their barns, but very few of them had insured their machines. No matter what the real scope of the riots may have been, the cost was high enough to aggravate insurance companies. Most of them simply refused to pay any dues out of fear that they'd bankrupt themselves. Many also raised their premiums so steeply that they drew criticism from the British government. Compared to the economic cost of the Swing riots, the psychological cost is easier to measure. Panic had spread across the English countryside as villagers swapped rumors that mysterious strangers had arrived in town to instigate social unrest. Depending on the rumor, these strangers were accused of being Irish Catholics, French revolutionaries, or homegrown radical leftists. In fact, The vast majority of rioters were simply disgruntled rural laborers, not religious conspirators or political ideologues. Rumors to the contrary were typically one of three things. First, a sign of mass hysteria. Second, an illustration of how difficult it was for privileged people to admit that all their neighbors hated them. Or, third, a convenient alibi for workers who'd participated in the riots to deny what really happened. The swing riots scandalized the country's rich and powerful. This kind of anarchy was supposed to stay in France. How could it happen here? As the initial shock wore off, a judicial crackdown followed. Across 24 counties, 96 people were arrested on charges of arson. None of them were strangers to their villages. They were overwhelmingly impoverished workers from the local area. In addition to the arsonists, more than 2,000 other people were arrested on miscellaneous charges. The majority of them were young men in their 20s and 30s. More than half were married. They had wives and children to support. But they believed that economic changes in the countryside had stolen their chance at a better future. Judges sentenced more than 25% of the accused to penal colonies in Australia. The convicts' wives and children had to stay behind in England. Lord Wellington's career was the last casualty of the 1830 upheaval. As rioters smashed their way across the countryside and London workers battled with the police, the Whigs and ultra-Tories in Parliament cried ever more loudly for electoral reform. Wellington's patrician snobbery and his bull-headed refusal to accept advice he didn't like spelled doom for his prime ministry. On November 2, 1830, he made the biggest blunder of his life by publicly declaring his wholehearted opposition to any calls for reform. Britain, he said, possesses a legislature which answers all good purposes of legislation, and this to a greater degree than any legislature ever has answered in any country whatsoever. In other words, the status quo was not only acceptable, it was literally the best thing that human history had to offer. As soon as Wellington sat down, a colleague whispered in his ear that he had just announced the fall of his own government. Sure enough, the cry in the streets began to change almost immediately. Now it wasn't just no police. Instead, it was no police, no Polignac. The London crowds had started to associate Lord Wellington with the regime of France's deposed King Charles X. Their implication was clear. The Prime Minister belonged to yesterday's ruling class. It was time for English patriots to throw him out, just like the French had done to the princes of Paris. For all his flaws as a politician, and there were many of them, Wellington was never a dictator. If he had been a different kind of man, he might have set the army on the English people. Then and now, he was the most respected military general in British history. Plenty of soldiers would have listened to his orders to provoke a civil war. Fortunately, Wellington believed in something greater than himself. When he saw that his time had come, he did his duty and resigned on November 15, 1830. As he stalked bitterly from 10 Downing Street, which he had always thought a small and ugly building undeserving of his noble presence, he griped that the country had descended into a state of insanity about reform. To the very last, he failed to understand the nation that he claimed to love and serve. Chapter 5. Reforming Parliament. After the fall of Wellington's government, the Tory party lost its hold on power for the first sustained period of time in almost 50 years. Unexpectedly, the Whig Party found itself in charge. As I explained in episode 1, the Whigs were more liberal than the Tories. They mistrusted unchecked royal power. They sympathized with dissenting Protestants. Most of them even supported Catholic emancipation. The Whigs, however, were progressive only by the standards of a privileged elite. As a group of wealthy landowners and merchants, their primary concern was always to defend the interests of their class. In this sense, the Earl Grey was the Whig Party's ideal representative. Today, the 19th century's most charismatic prime ministers all have eras named in their honor. In contrast, the Earl Grey's foremost legacy is his eponymous blend of tea. Actually, his name tells you everything you need to know about his character. He was an aristocrat, and personality-wise, he was a gray blur. When he became prime minister at 66, he was the second oldest man ever to hold that office. In 1830, he embraced the cause of electoral reform mostly because his party had decided that it was a winning platform. William Cobbett was a very different kind of man from Britain's new prime minister. He was the son of a common farmer, and he'd spent his childhood earning subsistence wages working as a human scarecrow. After serving several years in the British Army, Cobbett struggled to reconcile his earnest love of king and country with his disgust for the Tory party's corruption, riches, and entitlement. From his perspective, British conservative leaders seemed more concerned with making money than with upholding traditional values and defending the average citizen. Cobbett soon made a national name for himself by publishing pamphlets that idealized ordinary farmers, condemned aristocratic greed, and endorsed electoral reform. His inflammatory rhetoric alleged that foreigners, patricians, and plantation slaves oppressed the English working class by forcing down the value of their wages. Today, we've grown familiar with this kind of nativist populism. In the early 19th century, however, it was something relatively strange and new. Cobbett's fixation on the interests of the English working class placed him at odds with all of Britain's establishment parties. In 1810, he served a 2-year stint in prison for committing treasonous libel against the government. In 1817, the threat of further prosecution forced him to seek asylum in the United States. When he eventually returned to Britain, he came literally carrying the skeleton of his political hero, Thomas Paine, which he had disinterred with the intention of reburying it in England. Cobbett's politics grew still more radical during the crisis of reform. In 1830, he proclaimed his support for the swing riots, which resulted in another charge of treasonous libel. During the resulting trial, Cobbett turned the table on his accusers by subpoenaing 6 cabinet members and theatrically demanding that they answer for their crimes against the nation. To everyone's surprise, including his own, his case ended in acquittal. Naturally, this bolstered his renown among the English poor, who saw him as a straight-talking truth-teller fighting the entrenched interests of an aristocratic state. As the swing riots died down, as Lord Wellington's Tory government collapsed, and as the Earl Grey's Whigs took power, the time seemed ripe to reform Britain's electoral system. Cobbett and his fellow grassroots radicals were eager to uplift the working class. The Earl Grey was eager to associate himself with any policy that might attract new voters to the Whigs. The ultra-Tories, finally, were eager to elect a parliament willing to overturn Catholic emancipation. All these groups identified 3 problems with the British electoral system. Problem number 1: rotten boroughs. Britain's electoral districts varied dramatically in size and population. Some of them had been created in the Middle Ages, and they hadn't been redistricted since then. The borough of Old Sarum, for example, had been a bustling cathedral city in the 1100s. During the 1800s, in contrast, the place was home to only 7 voters. These 7 voters, by themselves, elected 2 members of Parliament. Depopulated boroughs like Old Sarum were called rotten because wealthy candidates for office could purchase them with only a few bribes. The second problem with the British electoral system was the inverse of the first. Whereas underpopulated 12th century towns like Old Sarum sent multiple representatives to Parliament, bustling industrial centers like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds sent none at all. Each of these large cities was home to tens of thousands of people. Unfortunately, those people hadn't lived there when the electoral map had been drawn centuries earlier. For electoral purposes, they basically didn't exist. The final problem with the British electoral system was its low suffrage rate. During the 19th century, the value of the property you owned determined whether you were legally allowed to vote. As a result, the government was of rich people, by rich people, for rich people. In England, only about 3.2% of the adult population was enfranchised. This situation offended practically everyone, but it proved especially galling to the upper middle class, whose members owned some property, belonged to respectable social clubs, and practiced good manners, but who were, ultimately, not quite privileged enough to rank among the country's rulers. Culturally speaking, the upper middle class shared so much in common with the very wealthy that it embarrassed and infuriated them to be deprived of voting rights. They were decent, law-abiding people. Why did Parliament insist on treating them like they were poor? Advocates of political reform usually fantasized that redrawing Britain's electoral districts and increasing the total number of voters would produce a parliament whose members favored their interests. The only problem was that Whigs, ultra-Tories, and radicals like Cobbett all had different interests. Because the coalition for reform was so unnatural, it proved extremely difficult to write a bill that everyone agreed on. The Whigs in the House of Commons introduced the first draft on March 1, 1831. That draft got bogged down in debate for months on end. In July, Commons finally submitted a revised version to the House of Lords, which needed to approve it before it could take effect. A bill designed to modernize an outdated electoral system didn't endear itself to a hereditary body of aristocrats, however. The Lords sat on the bill for 3 months, then rejected it in October 1831. For anyone counting, 7 months had now passed since the completion of the bill's first draft, and now things were back to square one. It seemed clear to everyone in Britain that the country's lawmakers were stalling. After the House of Lords rejected the Reform Bill, protest movements broke out across England. In the West Midlands, the powerful working-class pressure group known as the Birmingham Political Union mobilized more than 150,000 angry demonstrators for a single rally. The union's leader, Thomas Attwood, kept that rally peaceful through the power of his reputation. Elsewhere in England, leaderless protests quickly transformed into riots that targeted conservatives, aristocrats, and clergy. In London, an angry mob smashed the windows of Lord Wellington's private mansion. In Nottingham, someone set fire to the Duke of Newcastle's estate. In Bristol, arsonists torched houses, prisons, and the local bishop's palace. Coming hot on the heels of the swing riots, this resurgence of lower-class violence frightened many of the moderate Tories who had previously opposed reform. In March 1832, they helped the House of Commons pass a new draft of the Reform Bill. Prime Minister Grey warned the House of Lords not to reject this version. If they did, he'd ask King William to create new seats in the upper chamber until the Whigs had enough favorable votes to force a victory. This was a daring bluff, not least because the whole world knew that it lacked teeth. King William despised the prospect of reform. When the House of Lords summarily rejected the Reform Bill, he summarily refused to make new seats. The Earl Grey had been humiliated. He resigned his office in May 1832. The resulting political crisis pushed Britain to the brink of revolution. King William asked the Duke of Wellington to form a new Tory government that would bury the Reform Bill once and for all. Wellington agreed to do so, but Robert Peel, his right-hand man, refused an invitation to participate. Peel was a younger, more far-sighted politician than his mentor. He believed that he had decades left in his political career, and he suspected that opposing the Reform Bill would damage his reputation down the line. Without Peel's support, Wellington couldn't wrangle enough men to form a ministry. While he ineffectively corralled supporters, the Birmingham Political Union reorganized itself on paramilitary lines, and its leaders hinted before massive crowds that violent insurrection was the only way to put reform back on the table. A few days later, 1,500 workers gathered in Birmingham with pikes and muskets in their hands. Queen Adelaide wept and worried that she would be executed like the martyred Marie Antoinette. upper-middle-class reformers deliberately stoked these fears by organizing a coordinated media campaign. Under their guidance, newspapers like the Morning Chronicle, the Manchester Guardian, and the Times all published editorials warning that the only way to avert mass slaughter of the rich and powerful was to institute a program of reform without further delay. Today's historians still debate whether these so-called Days of May were really the calamity they seemed. In 1832, however, Britain's ruling class perceived the haunting specter of the guillotine no matter where they looked. Panic-stricken, they accepted that they had to grant reforms to save their lives. Because this change of heart reflected desperation, not earnest desire, the country's rulers tried to grant as little as they could. They decided that the best way forward was to pit the common people against one another. The plan, therefore, was to enfranchise the upper middle class, and, by giving them a stake in the political status quo, to discourage them from contemplating revolution ever again. On May 15, 1832, the Duke of Wellington informed King William that he couldn't form a government, that the Earl Grey was the only man for the prime ministry, and that the House of Lords needed to pass the Reform Bill immediately. William shed tears of rage and disappointment when he heard this news. But, between bursts of frustrated sobbing, he reluctantly agreed to create as many new seats as he had to in order to ensure the bill's success. In the end, no seats were necessary. The Days of May had terrified the House of Lords, which swiftly passed the Reform Bill into law on June 4, 1832. The Great Reform Act, as it's known today, is often remembered as the founding charter of the Victorian era. It's the centerpiece of what's arguably the greatest 19th century novel ever written, George Eliot's masterpiece Middlemarch. It's also one of the few Victorian laws that always has a section of its own in survey histories of Britain. According to the standard patriotic narrative these histories often tell, the Reform Act's passage was a triumph of British moderation and foresight. The Victorian era never had a revolution, so the story goes, because the Great Reform Act welcomed the upper middle class into government without the need for bloodshed, and because it paved the way for subsequent Reform Acts that slowly extended the franchise to the lower middle classes and the working poor. In fairness to the patriotic narrative, it's true that 19th century Britain was more stable than its European neighbors, and it's accurate to say that the Reform Act set an influential precedent for future generations. Having said that, we should take care not to praise the Act too unrestrainedly. For one thing, it came into existence because of, not instead of, the threat of revolutionary violence. For another thing, its enactment was the product of last-minute panic and desperation, not benevolent foresight or a master plan to slowly introduce a full democracy. In fact, far from introducing a democracy, the Great Reform Act was consciously designed to limit the spread of political participation and to salvage as much of the oligarchic status quo as possible. Anyone who wants to praise the Great Reform Act as the birth of a British democracy must be willing to acknowledge that it was a stillbirth. So what did the Reform Act actually achieve? First, it decreased the number of rotten boroughs by redrawing England's electoral districts. Second, it granted parliamentary representation to large industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds. Third, it expanded the size of the English electorate by about 45%. Fourth, it enabled Parliament to pass copycat acts for Scotland and Ireland in the summer of 1832. All of these achievements are impressive. Once you read the details, though, the Great Reform Act starts to look much more conservative than it initially appears. Remember that it went through several drafts before it passed the House of Lords. Each successive draft contained additional amendments engineered to make it more appealing to the rich and powerful. So, for example, the original version of the bill had proposed to enfranchise boroughs on the basis of their population. They would send no representatives to Parliament unless they were home to enough people. In the version of the bill that finally passed, however, boroughs were enfranchised partly on the value of the tax they paid. In other words, they'd send no representatives to Parliament unless they were home to enough rich people. As for the industrial cities, they gained seats in Parliament, but not in fair proportion to their populations. To the contrary, the Great Reform Act actually increased the disparity between rural and urban voters by creating new boroughs in the English countryside. And, just to be clear, voting rights still depended on property qualifications that excluded the vast majority of ordinary people from political participation. A 45% increase in enfranchised citizens meant that, rather than 3.2% of England's adult population, about 4.7% of them could vote in national elections. Oh, and there's one last turn of the screw. The Great Reform Act marked the first time in British history that women were officially, legally excluded from suffrage. By stipulating that all voters needed to be male, lawmakers had barred half the population from all hope of enfranchisement. Few professional historians today would say that the Great Reform Act was politically daring. Even in 1832, its most enthusiastic proponents described it as pragmatic, not as the fulfillment of lofty abstractions like natural law or the rights of man. The Earl Grey said that there is no one more decided against universal suffrage than I am. He meant that the Great Reform Act had secured Britain against revolution by empowering the best members of the upper middle class, who would now join the richest of the rich in their campaign to silence and suppress the country's common people. When I discussed the European revolutions of 1830 earlier in this episode, I emphasized that they resulted in a schism between proletarians and bourgeoisie. The same outcome emerged by different means in Britain. Here, the workers who had agitated for reform witnessed the upper middle class take power and declare, mission accomplished. There would be no universal suffrage after 1832. Instead, there would be a government campaign against the poor, a campaign designed to humiliate them, to terrorize them, and to punish them for all the trouble that they'd caused since the formation of Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police Force. The first fruit of the Great Reform Act was the hideous, infamous institution known as the workhouse. Chapter 6. Reforming Poor Relief. In December 1832, Parliament held an election for the first time since the Great Reform Act took effect. Just as the Whigs had hoped, the newly enfranchised upper middle class rewarded the party that had given them the right to vote. Whig candidates won an astonishing majority of 483 seats to their opponents' 175. One of those 175 belonged to first-time lawmaker William Cobbett. Neither a Whig nor a Tory, he called himself a radical, and he claimed to represent the British poor. In this chapter of the episode, we'll explore the institution that he spent the last year of his life attempting to destroy, the workhouse. Although rapid population growth and economic transformations in the countryside had recently increased the lower class's desperation, poverty itself was nothing new in Britain. In 1601, Parliament had instituted the Poor Relief Act to supplement the independent work of private charities with a more organized system of public welfare. This act classified the nation's needy into three main categories. The impotent were those who couldn't work, including the blind and the elderly. The able-bodied were those who couldn't find work, including farmers who'd had a bad harvest and craftsmen whose shops had burned down. Finally, the idle were those who, allegedly, refused to work, including tramps and vagrants. The 1601 Poor Relief Act gave local communities a substantial degree of autonomy to develop their own welfare systems. Most communities offered what historians call outdoor relief. This is what we tend to think of when we think of welfare nowadays. A local agency provides needy recipients with food, clothing, or money, but the recipients continue to live in their own homes and manage their own lives. Many of early modern Britain's communities also offered indoor relief, which looked quite different from today's welfare systems. Recipients of indoor relief would qualify for aid if they agreed to lead supervised lives inside a designated building. For the impotent, this building was typically an almshouse that nursed their health and provided for their basic needs. For the able-bodied, it was frequently a house of industry that offered useful work in times of economic hardship. For the idle, indoor relief usually meant imprisonment in a house of correction. By the 19th century, what had come to be known as the Old Poor Law was beginning to show its age. It had been designed for a nation of local communities whose members knew each other personally, but that nation was rapidly vanishing. Britain's population had increased from about 4 million in 1600 to about 14 million in 1830. Population growth contributed to landlessness and hunger, which produced huge waves of internal migration. Spotting the cracks in the welfare system, lawmakers began to fear that they foreshadowed revolutionary earthquakes. Therefore, the government appointed a royal commission to investigate the Poor Law's effectiveness across England and Wales. There were many excellent reasons to reform the poor relief system. Because there was no central governmental agency to oversee all parishes, local welfare agents often grew outrageously corrupt. Some of them skimmed money from the public trust. Others refused aid to people whom they didn't get along with. The most shameless agents coerced sexual favors out of needy women. Unfortunately, the Royal Commission appointed to investigate the Poor Law overlooked these problems. Rather than denouncing the exploitation of society's most vulnerable members, the commissioners condemned them as parasites. Most of these commissioners believed in the philosophy of Thomas Malthus, an economist who'd argued that the British population was increasing faster than the country's farmers could grow food. According to Malthusian theory, giving any form of monetary aid to poor people was irresponsible because it let them raise more children than the nation could support. Nassau Sr., the man who was supposed to be the intellectual heavyweight on the Royal Commission, subscribed so passionately to Malthus's ideas that he's alleged to have written his entire report on the Poor Law before gathering any evidence in the field. Then, when Sr. finally bothered to interview the recipients of poor relief, he did so using written questionnaires, even though most people in the working classes were illiterate. Despite these glaring flaws in the fact-finding process, the Royal Commissioners concluded that Britain's poor relief policies were much too generous. Far from alleviating suffering, they were allegedly increasing it by cultivating a surplus population of people who consumed resources without producing anything worthwhile in return. Seeking to decrease this surplus population, the commissioners urged Parliament to enact a new law that would actively deter the poor from pursuing financial assistance. Unlike the Great Reform Act, this suggestion met with strong bipartisan support. Everybody who held office understood that it would be a weapon of class warfare, wielded in retaliation for the popular unrest that had disrupted public life over the past 5 years. In August 1834, lawmakers passed the Poor Law Amendment Act, which most people simply called the New Poor Law. The New Poor Law established a Poor Law Commission run by 3 wealthy gentlemen. None of them had been elected, and none of them held seats in Parliament. Moreover, the commission wasn't legally a branch of government, which meant it wasn't subject to official oversight or regulation. Because the unelected, unaccountable commissioners convened in London's lavish Somerset House, the British public quickly nicknamed them the Somerset House Despots. Their job was to design and institute more cost-effective poor law practices on a parish-by-parish basis across England. In theory, each local community would retain control of its own welfare policies. In practice, the policies of all local communities were now susceptible to interference from a shadowy cabal of cost-cutters in central London. Soon, the Poor Law Commissioners made sweeping budget cuts across the country. Outdoor relief, which was believed to be too generous toward the poor, was frequently abolished altogether. Indoor relief, meanwhile, was made as unpleasant as possible. From 1834 onward, anyone who wanted to receive support would need to live inside a workhouse. Some workhouses were repurposed from existing structures. Others were built from scratch. All of them were sites of torment and abuse. The Poor Law Commissioners sought to decrease the number of welfare applicants by making the worst possible life outside a workhouse appear easier and more appealing than the best possible life inside one. Flawed though the old poor law had been, its communal orientation had generally accounted for welfare recipients' personalities, histories, and circumstances before making big decisions that would influence their lives. The new poor law, in contrast, depersonalized the poor by identifying economic independence as the most important mark of someone's character. Are you too old to work? Too sick? Too blind? Too pregnant? None of that matters anymore. For the purpose of the workhouse, you're just poor and lazy. So let's imagine, for a moment, that you're applying to enter the workhouse. Statistically, you're probably a child. By 1839, more than 1/2 of Britain's workhouse population was underage. Before you can receive relief, you'll need to undergo a series of interviews and inspections to determine your eligibility. If you're found to be legitimately poor, then you'll be placed in a probationary ward, where a doctor will examine you for signs of contagious disease. If you're sick, then you'll be quarantined. If you're healthy, you can skip this step. Upon entering the workhouse, you'll be separated from your family members. Men, women, boys, and girls reside in separate wards. Once you've been properly sorted, you'll be stripped naked, bathed, deloused, and given a standard haircut. Your clothing will be placed in storage so that you can wear a regulation uniform. It will be itchy, coarse, and plain, but fairly durable. Men will receive a jacket, waistcoat, hat, and pair of trousers. Women will receive a shapeless, ankle-length shift and a smock. From now on, your ward is your whole world. It has a communal dormitory, a communal dining hall, a kitchen, a laundromat, a tailor's workshop, a cobbler's workshop, and a garden. You'll attend church in the chapel. If you're a child, you'll attend school in the classroom. If you get sick, you'll go to the infirmary. If you die, you'll go to the morgue. Early each morning, the ringing of a bell will awaken you in an iron-frame bed with a thin mattress. Once you rise, you'll relieve yourself in a simple privy shared by as many as 100 other inmates. The staff will bathe you once per week. You can't bathe yourself. If you're a man, the staff will shave you once per week. You can't shave yourself. After every day's compulsory morning prayers, the bell will ring again to signal that it's time for breakfast. You'll eat a bowl of gruel in silence alongside fellow inmates while the master or the matron holds a roll call. Then it's time for the day's work to start. Women will wash clothes, tailor them, scrub the workhouse, or cook food for all the other inmates. Men will break rocks into paving stones, or they'll grind animal bones into fertilizer. Children will attend school, where they'll learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Boys will also learn geography and history. Girls will learn knitting and sewing. Everyone will break for lunch and dinner at the ringing of the bell. Typically, your meals will consist of bread and cheese. If you're lucky, you might get some dumplings, suet pudding, potatoes, gravy, or boiled meat. In any case, there will be little protein, few vegetables, and no fruit. After dinner, workhouse staff will hold a prayer session. Then, at the end of the day, they'll send you to bed. Based on what I've said so far, you might be thinking that the workhouse doesn't sound too bad. It's dehumanizing, lonely, and humiliating, yes, but surely it could be much worse. Remember, though, that your experience inside a workhouse would depend upon the whims of its administrators. Baroque sets of punishments accompanied long, arbitrary lists of rules and regulations. If you broke a rule, staff could flog you or withhold your meals. If you didn't like this treatment, you were free to leave at any time you wanted. After all, most lawmakers in Parliament thought welfare was a waste of money. They didn't want workhouses to be full. Their priority was to empty them as fast as possible. Death was one common way out. As cold, damp places where people lived in very close proximity to one another, workhouses were petri dishes for disease. Suicide also claimed many lives. Sexual abuse was rampant, spouses couldn't visit one another, and there sometimes seemed no hope of ever finding work and getting your life back on track. Finally, hunger contributed to workhouse death rates. In many workhouses, the diet was designed to keep inmates dissatisfied without allowing them to starve. At best, this meant that they were never truly full. At worst, it meant they were utterly desperate. In 1845, a workhouse in Andover became the subject of an infamous scandal when news broke that inmates assigned to grind animal bones into fertilizer had been cracking them open to slurp the raw, rotten marrow as food. If you died inside a workhouse, staff members notified your next of kin. It was their responsibility to organize and finance your funeral. If you had no family members, and many workhouse inmates didn't, then staff would arrange to bury your body at the lowest possible expense in a cheap coffin in an unmarked grave. If you were especially unlucky, then an even worse fate might await you. Mere months after the Great Reform Act, Parliament had passed the Anatomy Act. Under this law, any corpses left unclaimed for 48 hours could be purchased by medical schools, whose students would dissect them in the name of scientific progress. On paper, this act applied to all corpses. In practice, it affected only the most vulnerable members of society. Like the New Poor Law, the Anatomy Act was a weapon of class warfare designed to terrorize the British lower classes. To appreciate its power, imagine that you inhabit a deeply religious culture whose people overwhelmingly believe their bodies will be resurrected at the time of Christ's second coming. If a medical student dissects your body, then you'll be hideously and irrevocably mutilated in the afterlife. Will your loved ones recognize you in heaven? Will you even recognize yourself? Most lawmakers were very pleased with Britain's new regime of workhouses, which kept the masses fearful and the wealthy taxpayers at ease. In the first decade after the regime's creation, government spending on poor relief decreased by more than 35%. Some legislators actually demanded even more gargantuan cuts to public spending. With the benefit of hindsight, there's really no way to deny that cruelty was the point of the New Poor Law. Between 1848 and 1870, only 15% of workhouse inmates were able-bodied adults. The other 85% were children, the chronically ill, the elderly, or people with disabilities. They were, in other words, people who couldn't work and who were therefore subject to a regimen of torment solely for torment's sake. Nevertheless, in 1838, Parliament transplanted the New Poor Law system onto Ireland. In 1845, it did the same to Scotland. There, as in Wales and England, the system's goal was to spread terror and cut costs. William Cobbett led a tiny parliamentary clique opposed to the New Poor Law. He made thunderous speeches denouncing the workhouse as a vicious institution that transformed free citizens of England into something worse than Caribbean slaves. The social contract, he insisted, had been overturned. The nation's poor no longer owed allegiance to their government. They could rebel against it with impunity. Cobbett would almost certainly have faced a fresh sedition charge if he had lived another month or two. But he was an old man, and he passed away in 1835, less than a year after the Poor Law took effect. With his death, parliamentary opposition to the workhouse all but ended. Popular opposition, in contrast, continued unabated. Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, which appeared in serial installments between 1837 and 1839, has gone down in history as the definitive attack on the New Poor Law. Even if you haven't seen the book's spectacular musical adaptation, Oliver, you've probably heard Lionel Bart's famous song, Food, Glorious Food.
Food, glorious food, hot sausage and mustard.
Considering the story's cultural impact, first-time readers of Oliver Twist are often surprised to find that the title character spends just 3 of the novel's 53 chapters in a workhouse. As a whole, the book is less preoccupied with the New Poor Law than it is with life among the underclass in London's slums. We'll spend more time discussing Oliver Twist in the next episode, but while we're on the subject of the workhouse, it's worth considering how Dickens' portrayal of that institution reflects his attitude toward poverty more generally. Hunger, for example, is a recurring motif of the novel. In the most famous scene of the book, the young Oliver dares to ask the master of the workhouse for more food. He rose from the table and, basin and spoon in hand, said, somewhat alarmed at his own temerity,
Please, sir, I want some more.
The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds, and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralyzed with wonder, the boys with fear. "What?" said the master at length, in a faint voice.
Please, sir,
Replied Oliver.
I want some more.
The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in his arm, and shrieked aloud. In this scene, and in the accompanying illustration by George Cruikshank, the fat, healthy frame of the workhouse master contrasts sharply with the body of the small, emaciated boy begging for food. Actually, Oliver requests more food solely because he and the other children in the workhouse are beginning to imagine eating one another. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last, they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hadn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cookshop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid that he might, some night, happen to eat the boy who slept next to him, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and the other boys implicitly believed him. Although Dickens plays this scene for comic effect, its deeper message is a serious one. Rather than teaching the children a moral lesson about moderation or frugality, the workhouse's miserly portions threaten to plunge them into the unforgivable crime of cannibalism. Throughout the novel, only the most wicked characters believe that poor people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. For example, the villainous Fagin insists that self-interest produces a healthy society. He tells his gang of juvenile pickpockets that a regard for number one holds us all together. The more you value your number one, the more careful you must be of mine. Dickens' point, of course, is that Fagin is wrong, that self-interest destroys communities, and that the most self-interested people of all are the petty tyrants overseeing England's workhouses. Despite the force of this critique, Dickens was never a radical. Although Oliver Twist contains moments of genuine outrage toward the British state at large, it prefers to deploy light-hearted satire against insignificant local officials. One such official, Mr. Bumble, is a clumsy idiot, but not an existential threat to human life. Because he doesn't have the intellectual or physical capacity to exude any genuine malice, we're more inclined to laugh at his pretensions to absolute power than we are to honor his authority. Throughout the novel, Bumble remains a very minor antagonist. Several adaptations even remove him from the narrative entirely, and his absence doesn't compromise the story as a whole. Ultimately, Bumble's character illustrates the contrast between Charles Dickens and William Cobbett. Cobbett's tirades targeted the uppermost echelons of British society and government in such specific and such furious terms that they resulted in criminal charges. Dickens, in contrast, left Britain's elites alone. Whereas Cobbett demanded action against the perpetrators of injustice, Dickens fostered sympathy with the victims. He didn't want his readers rallying in the streets. He wanted them to shed a quiet tear inside their private homes. To that end, his portrayal of workhouse inmates dwells upon angelic women and innocent children. Oliver's late mother, Agnes, is said to be a poor young thing with a beautiful, mild face. Dickens strongly implies that she didn't deserve to suffer in a workhouse. Whether he thinks anyone deserves that fate is a more troubling question. Here, we find the central dilemma of Oliver Twist. The title character is sympathetic for as long as he's a little boy. But one day, he'll grow into a man who says, "I want some more." Can the novel and its readers sympathize with adult men as well as with women and children? Do they even want to try? But I've gotten ahead of myself. Oliver Twist was Dickens' second novel. Before we analyze it any further, we need to appreciate what he achieved with his first. In the next chapter of this episode, I'll discuss the Pickwick Papers. It appeared at the tail end of Britain's crisis of reform. It used a serial narrative structure to reimagine fiction as a form of political criticism. And, in the process, it invented the Victorian novel as we know it. Chapter 7. Charles Dickens' The Pickwick Papers. Some writers find success later than others. Charles Dickens got a head start on the rest. He was only 24 years old when he began to serialize his debut novel. Dickens had grown up lower middle class in London. During his early 20s, he'd worked as a journalist who specialized in parliamentary elections and debates. Soon, however, he started to publish lively, semi-fictional accounts of life in the big city. The success of these accounts, which Dickens wrote under the pen name Boz, encouraged the publisher Chapman and Hall to commission him for a new project. His assignment was to write amusing stories to accompany a caricature series drawn by the renowned cartoonist Robert Seymour. Dickens was initially the junior partner of this venture. He had no control over the caricature's content, and he would need to write about 8,000 words per month for 20 monthly parts. More established writers had rejected the assignment because it offered little money in exchange for a lot of unglamorous work. When the project's opening installment was released in early 1836, Seymour's cartoons, not Boz's stories, were the main attraction. That soon changed, however. By the time the series ended in November 1837, Seymour had been forgotten, and Boz had become a celebrity. Mere weeks after the project's serial run concluded, its installments were compiled and reissued as a novel. Crucially, that novel was attributed to Charles Dickens, not his pen name. How can we explain this sudden revolution in his fortunes? For one thing, Dickens' experience as a political journalist had given him a sharp ear for dialogue and a quick hand for deadlines. He could produce huge quantities of sparkling prose in very little time. For another thing, Dickens harbored the ambition, or the tactlessness, of a young man. He frequently stepped out of line to critique Seymour, who was 15 years his senior and who was supposed to have creative control over the project. The two of them fought constantly over small details of the narrative and illustrations. After a few weeks of arguments, Seymour committed suicide. He suffered from a history of mental illness, but even the most ardent Dickens fans have to admit that the young author's bullishness likely made matters worse. In any case, a younger, less experienced cartoonist replaced Seymour. Dickens became the project's senior member and its creative director by default. When the project was republished as a novel, it was titled The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, containing a faithful record of the perambulations, perils, travels, adventures, and sporting transactions of the corresponding members. Thankfully, the book is better known simply as the Pickwick Papers. Its story follows the misadventures of the Pickwick Club, a group of 4 upper-middle-class oddballs dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of humankind. In chapter after chapter, Dickens gently satirizes the club members' pretensions to importance. Mr. Pickwick, their leader, is a chubby, childlike ex-businessman who uses his private fortune to fund extravagant research projects. Nathaniel Winkle is a self-described sportsman who struggles with the basic rules of riding horses. Augustus Snodgrass is a romantic poet with no talent whatsoever. Tracy Tupman prides himself as a great lover and seducer, despite his fat stomach and advancing age. The novel's early chapters are self-contained and very thinly plotted. They resemble sitcoms like Seinfeld or Friends. In later chapters, the narrative grows more cohesive. As you read through the Pickwick Papers, you can watch Dickens gradually assume full control over the project and realize what he's capable of doing with it. His publishers hadn't asked for a strong central plot, but that's what they eventually received. Rather than discussing every detail of this book, which is about 800 pages of small print, I want to draw your attention to a handful of significant moments related to the crisis of reform that we've explored throughout this episode. Consider yourself warned that the remainder of this chapter will be full of plot spoilers. But remember that the Pickwick Papers has been on the market for nearly 200 years, and that its plot isn't the most important thing about it anyway. Let's begin with Dickens' gentle satire of bureaucracy and fact-finding. In Chapter 11, Mr. Pickwick makes an immortal discovery. While traveling through the English countryside, he uncovers a small broken stone, partially buried in the ground. Something strange about it captivates him. "There is an inscription here," he marvels. "I can discern a cross, and a B, and then a T. This is some very old inscription," he concludes. Hoping to learn more, Mr. Pickwick knocks upon the front door of a nearby cottage, whose owner sells him the stone for the exorbitant price of 10 shillings. The narrator reports that the exaltation and joy of the Pickwickians knew no bounds when their patience and assiduity, their washing and scraping of the artifact, were crowned with success. The stone was uneven and broken, and the letters were straggling and irregular. But the following fragment of an inscription was clearly to be deciphered. What follows on the page is an incomprehensible jumble of letters. B, I, L, S, T, U, M, P. Mr. Pickwick's eyes sparkled with delight, and he sat and gloated over the treasure he had discovered. He had attained one of the greatest objects of his ambition. In a country known to abound in the remains of every early age, in a village in which there still existed some memorials of the olden time, he, the chairman of the Pickwick Club, had discovered a strange and curious inscription of unquestionable antiquity, which had wholly escaped the observation of the many learned men who had preceded him. A whirlwind of committee meetings, lectures, and debates ensues as the Pickwick Club struggles to interpret the stone's strange inscription. Mr. Pickwick writes a 96-page pamphlet that proposes 27 different readings. Thanks to his scholarship, he's elected an honorary member of 17 native and foreign societies. Imagine the Pickwick Club's embarrassment when a certain Mr. Blotton, whose name will be doomed to the undying contempt of those who cultivate the mysterious and sublime, speaks out at a public meeting. Blotton says he knows Bill Stumps, the humble laborer from whom the stone was purchased. In fact, Stumps himself carved the inscription while he was in an idle mood. B, I, L, S, T, U, M, P spells out nothing more interesting than his name. The Pickwick Club receives this statement with contempt. Then, after expelling the presumptuous and ill-conditioned Blotton, the club members award Mr. Pickwick a ceremonial pair of gold spectacles in recognition of his academic prowess. In this scene, and in many others like it, Dickens promotes the common-sense knowledge of everyday people above the expertise of pompous fact-finders. Mr. Pickwick is a kind, well-meaning man, but he's so privileged that he's totally out of touch with reality. We might read this scene in light of something like the Royal Commission that investigated the old poor law. Just as the economist Nassau Sr. had denounced that law before conducting any field research, so Mr. Pickwick and his fellow club members leap to wild conclusions about the inscription's meaning, and they refuse to listen when an ordinary laborer tells them the truth. Ultimately, the bombast of the Pickwick Club echoes the outbursts of the clown and conman Alfred Jingle, who speaks exclusively in semi-comprehensible sound bites.
Terrible place. Dangerous work. Other day. 5 children. Mother. Tall lady. Eating sandwiches. Forgot the arch. Crash! Knock! Children look round. Mother's head off. Sandwich in her hand. No mouth to put it in. Head of a family off. Shocking! Shocking!
Much like Mr. Jingle's sound bites, the Pickwick Papers' early serial installments are only loosely connected to each other. Readers could buy one issue of the story, skip the next, and then pick up the third without needing a recap. By and large, the book is a work of picaresque fiction. This means that it has a highly episodic structure, a realistic urban setting, and a satirical tone. In certain installments, however, Dickens opts for something completely different. Without warning, the story will become a romance, a mystery, or a work of Gothic horror. Chapter 28, for example, is a standalone Christmas issue in which Mr. Pickwick's friend tells him a ghost story about goblins who try to abduct a churchyard's caretaker. In this story, Gabriel Grubb is digging a grave after sunset on Christmas Eve. He's a bitter, misanthropic man who chuckles to himself as he lifts shovelfuls of earth.
A coffin at Christmas. A Christmas box. Ho, ho, ho.
Suddenly, he hears a voice from a nearby gravestone.
Ho, ho, ho,
it cries, echoing his laughter. Spinning around, Grubb sees not Santa Claus, but rather the strange, unearthly figure of a goblin who taunts him, condemns his misanthropy, and warns him that,
my friends want you.
Whole troops of goblins pour into the churchyard and begin playing at leapfrog with the tombstones. The Goblin King cackles and drinks a goblet of liquid fire before showing Grubb a series of visions in which the extremes of human suffering exist side by side with the extremes of love and beauty.
You are a miserable man,
the Goblin King sneers. Just when it seems that the goblins will drag Grubb to hell, he has a sudden epiphany. Men like himself, who snarled at the mirth and cheerfulness of others, were the foulest weeds on the whole surface of the earth. At that very moment, the sun rises, the goblins vanish, and on Christmas morning, Grubb awakens on a flat gravestone in the churchyard. His soul has been saved. Newly reborn, he vows to be a better man forever afterward. This story, which foreshadows Dickens' later tale, A Christmas Carol, offers a Gothic alternative to the Pickwick Papers' other, more realistic chapters. In doing so, it allows the novel to explore crime and punishment from a new point of view. Here, there are no sweeping social problems, only individual sins. Robert Peel's police officers are nowhere to be seen, and a complex judicial apparatus is unnecessary in a world where troops of goblins have the power to scare sinners straight. Apart from its portrayal of crime and punishment, Dickens' Christmas story is significant because it showcases a narrative that's straining to escape an episodic format. The Goblin story takes place over 2 successive chapters, both of which are numbered 28. The narrator excuses this peculiar stylistic choice by claiming that we had quite forgotten all such petty restrictions as individual chapter divisions. By late 1836, audiences liked the Pickwick Papers' characters so much that they were buying every single issue of the serial. These impressive sales metrics made Dickens and his publishers feel confident enough to risk indulging in a long-form plot. That plot fully emerges when a judge condemns poor Mr. Pickwick to serve time inside Fleet Prison. From this point, the narrative pursues 2 running storylines. In the first of them, the Cockney manservant Sam Weller gradually evolves from an unimportant side character into a central protagonist. This evolution is a fossil record of the Pickwick Papers' serial format. As you read the book, you can see Dickens deciding in real time whose story it should tell, and changing his plans accordingly. Anyone who pays attention will perceive that Sam became the author's favorite character. He speaks in a comic dialect. He lives by good fortune and charm. In essence, he serves as the humble, earthy Sancho Panza to the pompous, flighty Mr. Pickwick's Don Quixote. Dickens wrote the Pickwick Papers in an era of reform, when many wealthy people worried that the lower classes were encroaching on their powers, rights, and privileges. Sam's rise to the status of a major character mirrors this encroachment, insofar as it pushes the gentlemanly Mr. Pickwick to the margins of the novel named in his honor. Nevertheless, readers of all social classes loved and laughed with Sam. There was no harm in making merry with a fictional manservant. It would have been another thing entirely to give his real-life counterparts the right to vote. But what about the unfortunate Mr. Pickwick, who spends the second half of his own novel languishing inside a jail cell? In the novel's other running plotline, Dickens uses lengthy prison scenes to criticize the rapidly ballooning British penal system. One prisoner exclaims, "Friends, if I lay dead at the bottom of the deepest mine in the world, tight screwed down and soldered in my coffin, rotting in the dark and filthy ditch that drags its slime along beneath the foundations of this prison, I could not be more forgotten or unheeded than I am here. I am a dead man, dead to society." The narrator confirms this prisoner's words to be the barest, most revolting truth imaginable. Inside Fleet Prison, an old man stares at the stone floor with an expression of the deepest and most hopeless despair. A young girl, his little granddaughter, hangs helplessly upon his arms. In these scenes, the Pickwick Papers bleakly evokes a world where the incarcerated population's only crime is that of being poor. Apart from their political importance, the novel's prison scenes are vital to its literary structure. After Mr. Pickwick has been locked away, the narrative can't wander freely like it did in previous chapters. Rather than a vibrant cast of characters in diverse settings, Mr. Pickwick interacts with the great body of the prison population over and over and over again. He encounters the same squalor, the same turmoil and noise, the same general characteristics in every corner. "My head aches with these scenes," he moans. Dickens, in contrast, relished the narrative's new structure. Writing a long-form story gave him the opportunity to make his characters deeper and more complex. Mr. Pickwick, for example, transforms from a stereotypical crackpot into a self-reflective figure who's aware that he inhabits a role in a textual world. Many of the people whom he meets have read about him in the newspapers. They know his name, and they're familiar with his adventures. As a result, he can no longer live each day in splendid isolation from the one before it. Strangers scrutinize his every action and predict what he'll do next. He has become the subject of a popular running plot. The Pickwick Papers became one of the real world's earliest mass cultural sensations, spawning spin-offs, musical adaptations, and collectible merchandise. Today, it's most often remembered as the novel in which Charles Dickens discovered his voice as an author. Of all his books, it's among the strangest from a formal point of view because it clearly bears the scars of its serial publication. Its formal strangeness, however, also allows it to foreshadow almost all the topics and techniques that Dickens would explore in later, far more polished works. In this novel of contradictions, we see a coherent narrative struggling to emerge from the chaos of isolated episodes, and we feel deeply for characters who strive to make us laugh and cry in equal measure. Pickwick's skepticism of bureaucracy, its critique of prisons, and its elevation of a working-class protagonist can be imagined as the endpoint of the crisis of reform that started with demands for Catholic emancipation. In the conclusion to this episode, I'll reflect on how that crisis finally gave way to a new status quo. By the mid-1830s, Britain's socio-political landscape looked more modern than it ever had. But was the country really any better than before? Conclusion. I want some more. The crisis of reform that we've explored throughout this episode began when Daniel O'Connell's campaign for Catholic emancipation sent British lawmakers scrambling to preserve as much of the exclusionary status quo as possible. Over the years that followed, wealthy politicians abolished restrictions upon Catholic officeholders, but they also created police forces and prison complexes, forged a new alliance with the upper middle class, and transformed the workhouse into the epicenter of poor relief. In December 1834, the crisis of reform finally ended. That month, a Tory government took office under the leadership of Prime Minister Robert Peel, who'd finally escaped from Lord Wellington's shadow. Although Peel was the new leader of the Tory party, he made no attempt to undo the reforms that Parliament had enacted under a Whig government. Instead, on December 18th, he published the so-called Tamworth Manifesto, a political statement of intent that laid the groundwork for a newer, sleeker, more modern conservative movement. Peel's manifesto recognized that zealous opposition to reform was no longer a winning cause. It conceded that the Great Reform Act marked the final and irrevocable settlement of a great constitutional question. The Tories, consequently, wouldn't try to overturn it. Instead, they'd commit themselves to a program of measured, incremental social change. By undertaking a careful review of institutions, civil and ecclesiastical, the party would preserve the best aspects of the British Constitution while carefully pruning the worst. Wherever real grievances existed, the Tories would take steps to remedy them. In short, the Tamworth Manifesto brought the reform crisis to a close by accepting progress as inevitable. At least as a concept, controlled reform no longer posed an existential threat to either side of the political establishment. It had become the new normal. Peel lasted less than 4 months as Prime Minister before the Whigs resumed control of government. Despite his tenure's brevity, he left a permanent impact on the reformed Tory party. It still housed a far-right faction of reactionary ultras who despised the Whigs and wanted to turn back history by 50 years. This faction, however, was now obviously a minority, and the Tamworth Manifesto's popularity ensured that it would stay as such. By the mid-1830s, Whigs and mainline Tories had embraced reform because it won them votes. Their decision was pragmatic, not ideological. It guaranteed that Parliament remained the playground of the rich and powerful. Almost every lawmaker wanted to shore up the elite's class privileges against the rising tide of ordinary people's anger. In this context, reform was nothing but a tool to keep things more or less as they had always been. The Reform era's effects echoed throughout the Victorian period and beyond. When famine ravaged Ireland in 1845, the question of humanitarian relief became the final battleground between Daniel O'Connell and his nemesis Robert Peel. Parliament didn't enact universal manhood suffrage until after World War I. Women had to wait still longer for the vote. Britain's last workhouse closed in 1948. Patriotic narratives of British history often frame it as a heroic march of progress across time. For example, the conservative writer Niall Ferguson argues that British imperial expansion spread representative assemblies and the idea of liberty around the world. This argument aligns the political developments of the early Victorian period with an idea of modernity defined by freedom and democracy. Given what we've seen throughout this episode, I hope it's clear that Ferguson's interpretation of the past amounts to little more than self-congratulatory myth. Although we shouldn't downplay the Reform era's achievements, it would be wrong to understand them as the conscious policy of a benevolent state looking to serve humanity's best interests. Instead, What emerged during the 1830s was a new alliance between Britain's aristocracy and its upper middle class, who collaborated with each other to exclude the vast majority of people from political participation. Freedom, as this alliance defined it, meant little more than the freedom to accumulate, to profit, to debar, to arrest, and to incarcerate. It's entirely appropriate that the most enduring image of Britain's reform period is George Cruikshank's illustration of a hungry child holding out an empty bowl, begging a fat workhouse master, "Please, sir, I want some more." Throughout the early 1830s, Britain's ordinary people begged for rights. They received police forces and prisons in return. In this podcast's next episode, we'll discover how ordinary people managed to survive and even thrive despite these hardships. I'll lead you on a walking tour of early Victorian London as seen through the eyes of its poorest inhabitants. Together, we'll meet rat catchers, nest sellers, street clowns, and match girls. We'll explore the origin of a rabid anti-vaccination movement. We'll witness the House of Commons burning to the ground. Finally, we'll spend time with some of the most celebrated Londoners to ever live, Oliver Twist and his friends. I'm Brian Reinken. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting into Air. For more information about this episode, you can visit our website at meltingintoair.net, where we've posted show notes, artwork, and a movie list. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please visit our Patreon for exclusive content and other membership benefits. And if you have any comments or questions, you can reach us at info@meltingintoair.net. This is Brian Reinken. See you in episode 3.